So our first speaker is Chhavi Jain. Chhavi's thesis committee includes Professors Abhishek Ganguly, Sage Gerson, and Ijlal Muzaffar.
Thank you, Eric. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here, everybody who's here physically and everybody who's joined on Zoom. I'm Chhavi Jain. I am a curator, a writer, and Indian classical dancer. I have been an art consultant. I am also a researcher, and it is a combination of all these practices that I bring to my thesis work that I have developed over the last 1.5 years of being in Providence. Every so often when an opportunity arises, I call myself a storyteller. So let me tell you a story. This is one of my favorite stories to narrate about my familial ancestry. It was passed on to us by my grandparents on my father's side. My grandfather was born on 10th November 1940. My grandmother, she's believed to be born on 23rd October 1943. They lived in Sialkot back then with their respective families. Sialkot is a city in Punjab, northwest India, which is now in Pakistan. Early 1947. Rumors of a possible partition of the country were slowly making the rounds. My Dadu and Dadi recall how at that time, no one had thought that this could actually happen. But the tensions were building. So the elders in the family, they had the foresight to temporarily migrate, or what they thought was temporary, to keep their family safe. My grandmother with the family migrated to the city of Jalandhar, further south in Punjab, which is in present-day India. My grandfather's family first moved almost 30 kilometers north of Sialkot in Jammu. The partition was officially announced and riots broke out. My grandparents at that time were almost 7 and 4 years old. My sister and I first learned about the partition in our history textbooks. We had not fathomed that our grandparents had lived through a time so gruesome and tragic. When we came to know about it, we picked their brains to no end, asking them all sorts of questions. What was it like to live during that time? Did you live in refugee camps? Did you see massacred bodies? Did you know why you were leaving your home? And how do you remember Sialkot? We practically asked them to remember anything they could from a time and a place that neither of us had revisited. My grandparents are upfront about not remembering very much. After all, it has been more than 75 years, and their home is now in Delhi with us. This is our story. It is incomplete and yet valuable. I like to tell the story when people ask me about my familial identity, a Jain Punjabi from Delhi. It has raised more eyebrows than I can count. To be born Jain, a religious minority in India, and a Punjabi from the Punjab region of northwest India together is rare. You're either one or the other, people tell me. But what I do know is that we are Sialkotis, people from Sialkot, and thereby Jains from Punjab. Sialkotis are known to have an uncompromising sweet tooth. In our house, my grandfather and father really relish sweets. The likes of ghevar, halwa, jalebi, gulab jamun, common desserts in the Indian subcontinent, and the occasional cake. The third generation, my sister and I, love sweets too, but we prefer chocolates, waffles, cookies, etc. Sometimes I think that the walls of our home will resound the commonly asked questions, "Aaj meethe mein kya hai?" What's for dessert today? This love for sweets, or what I call the legacy of sweet tooth, comes from a history that precedes me and from the people who are outside of me. And yet, they inform who I am and where I come from. Every once in a while, an untouched pile of Indian sweets disappoints our grandfather. But I believe that we are Sialkotis too, only in a globalized world. Sweet tooth translates differently through us. My thesis is about that one sentence. So I've titled my book, Curating within Indigenous Ecosystems of Art and Storytelling. My core themes triangulate between indigeneity, art, and curation, which extend 3 primary lines of inquiry. It is about curation's relationship with care, storytelling, and community. And these form the 3 chapters in my thesis. I bring to my thesis questions and curiosities that emerged during my curatorial practice in India. Curation has been a way for me to bring my training, experience, and interests together in generative ways. It has also enabled me to expand my knowledge on various subjects and devise my own definitions of best practice. I meditate on curation as the space in between, the gap, the bridge, and the interstice between the artist and the viewer. When it comes to indigenous art, I ask, why are the markets not in the least equitable for contemporary and contemporary indigenous practices in a post-colonial global world? My use of equity here is primarily for representation and monetary value, an example of which can be seen in the statistics here. The record holders for the highest selling indigenous work is by Clifford Possum at $1.38 million. And the record for the highest selling contemporary artist is, like you can see here, Jeffrey Koons at $90 million. Now, when I moved to Providence last year, I wanted to examine these questions in this demographic as well. I learned about the terminologies of indigenous, which comes from the Latin indigena, which means native, sprung from land. In colonial vocabularies, indigenous has been used to refer not just to people but also flora and fauna. It suffuses the term with a racial flavor and it connotes wildness. I use the term indigenous as contextualized by Sean Wilson as inclusive of all First Peoples, unique in our own cultures, this is a quote, but common in our experiences of colonialism and our understanding of the world. To work with the theme of curation in a two-dimensional space as I do in this book, I produced two specific case studies. One is through virtual interviews with Angel Beth Smith, a curator and an artist, and with Silver Moon LaRose, artist, educator, and public servant, and assistant director at the Tomaquag Museum. Both are from the Narragansett community, which is indigenous to Rhode Island. In the case of India, indigeneity is not rooted in the binary logic of indigenous and settler colonial as it is in the West. Indian constitution does not refer to any groups or communities as indigenous to the land. However, Adivasis and tribals are commonly referred to as the indigenous people. Adivasi is a combination of two Sanskrit words, Adi and Vasi, which means earliest inhabitants. I use the term Adivasi to refer to the Gond Pradhan community in Madhya Pradesh, central India, who use the same to refer to themselves as well. This is my second case study. As I'm continuing to know and build relationship with the members of this community, I have had a long-standing friendship with Mayank Sham, who is from the community for a long time. I have also interviewed him for my thesis. Now, why do I bring up curation and why do I bring up care? Let me tell you another story. Jangar Singh Sham was a leading artist who created the genre Jangar Kalam. It was through him first that Gond art came to be formalized as art and known in the world. He was from the Adivasi community of Gond Pradhans. He lived in Bhopal and Madhya Pradesh, where his wife Nankusia Bai, his daughter Jabani Sham, and son Mayank Sham continue to live today. Sham first traveled to Japan in the 1980s for a few days. Then he returned. He named his daughter Japani after Japan. In 2001, he was invited again for a period of 3 months for a residency in the Mithila Museum of Japan. And he accepted. This was the longest he had been away from home. He did not know the Japanese language, and neither did the museum people know Gondi or Hindi, the languages that he spoke. So communication was naturally very difficult. Sham communicated with his family through letters and waited patiently as the time to return home came closer. He later got to know that the curator of the museum had extended his stay, saying that he needed to complete the number of paintings he had promised. This was a breaking point for him. People say that that's when he went into a shell, until one day, on the 3rd of July, he committed suicide. It was right in the middle of the museum, at his workplace, where he was found. This incident was conveyed to his family via fax. Since he was the benefactor to the community, the ripples of anxiety and remorse went through not just his family but also the community. His nephew and artist Venkat Sham recounts in his autobiography titled Finding My Way how at that time people blamed themselves and each other for what had happened. He also talks about the duplicity of the narrative by the museum He says, and I quote, "They say Sham had lost balance. They claim that he had been on antidepressants." He responds to them by asking, why did an artist of Jangar's caliber work for a monthly wage of $300 in a foreign land? He continues to ask, why did the man who had showed us the way left us? We don't know how or why. The truth died with Jangar. This is the story where my inquiries in the relationship between care and curation formally began. This is where I situate the intention of care in curation, taking it back to its Latin roots, curare, which means to care. And I ask, what role does a curator play in imagining representation and simultaneously creating, producing, or situating orality and indigenous knowledge as legible portals of knowledge? I argue that a lot of harm has been done when it comes to representing indigeneity as anonymous, exoticized, criminalized, co-opted, and even extinct. I enter this space as a non-Adivasi individual with the aim to engage with, learn from, and support the development of methods and approaches in curation that counter the prevalent colonial simulacra. Bearing Sham's instance in mind, the personhood of an Adivasi life in social transition, I invoke the relevance of the need to make space and curate with care. In India, Adivasi curation is a rare phenomenon. It is what Annapurna Garimella, an art historian, calls among the least curated categories. This is also evidenced by the presence of only one Adivasi curator in India, Madan Meena from the Meena community. He's a miniature artist as well, and he believes that Meena art from his community has a ritualistic value and it's problematic when it's sold. Now, Jangar Sham's son, Mayank Sham, is also a gone artist. I have known him to be a wonderful storyteller. He tells me that the market has told him his work's value, that he did not know it. At 35, he has found a stable market for his works in India, Japan, and in France. He says that he knows how to deal with the demand to produce more works in the market as well. He says when we succumb to the market to only compete, the work suffers. It loses its maulikta, its fundamental essence or quality. He says, when I feel that something is beyond the scope of my commitment, I ask for more time or I respectfully apologize. By grace, the work is going well, so I can afford the time to breathe. But sometimes I worry about offending people. I use the expression "in the room with," which I find a fitting phrase to talk about my methodology and research process. The preposition "with" instead of "for" or "on" is used deliberately to challenge the binary of the researcher and the subject. This underlines for me the historical and personal storytelling, which is in keeping with my approach to perform research through conversations with people. Positionality is a layered concept, I argue. While it situates the researcher in some contexts, it also creates distance. Witness is carried in the essence of relationships and trust that can be built over time. Another beginning of a wonderful relationship was during my visit to the Tomaquag Museum. I visited with Professor Gerson's class earlier this spring. The Tomaquag is Rhode Island's only museum entirely dedicated to the stories of indigenous people of this land. These are some pictures that I clicked their collection. We saw textiles, weaving techniques, beadwork, pottery, utensils, jewelry, old pamphlets, posters, magazines, photographs. The list is not exhaustive. Some of these were recently created and brought into display. The work to dig into histories and the work to collect, create, and display materials and objects continues at the Tomaquag. In one of my virtual correspondences with Angel Beth-Smith, she talks about how museums can be enlivened places of wonder, where the mind can dream what was, and the eyes can see what was. LaRoche contributes to this by saying that the museums can be done right. She says, and I quote, "Give everything back to the communities they originated from. Allow the communities to decide if and how they would like to share these cultural belongings. And then they have the power to determine what to share and how. When native people curate their own exhibits, you're no longer viewing objects. You're being introduced to a family story." Art in this way has been embedded in both the communities I bring here, the Narragansett community and Gone Pradhans, in their way of being. Among the Gone Pradhans, in their age-old tradition of music performance that now translates as visuals on various mediums in their contemporary painting practice. And among the Narragansets, it's everywhere, from a painting to a traditional regalia to a cooked meal. In the native language, La Rose has not seen a word for artist or art. That is why it has been difficult for her to claim the title of an artist, and she says that she's still getting used to that word. Art, in that way, has existed in the indigenous communities here long before it was even called art. The presence of curatorial research and the perspective empowers placemaking, working with communities and disseminating stories and knowledges in relevant contexts. Along with the Tomakwag in my larger thesis work, I also talk about the Arna Charna Museum in West India, where the imagined audience are the people from within the communities. But to keep with the time of this presentation, if someone wants to know more about it, please ask in the Q&A. Now, to make time for Q&A, I will conclude this segment quickly by saying that my proposition here is that instead of an exhibitionary focus in collections and academia of taking up space, as curators, we need to consider making space for practices, logic, and narratives that do not need to translate for the world. This is like the legacy of Sweet Tooth that persists through the constructs of time and borders of the nation state and translates with some tension. I invoke the sensibility of making to enable an imagination beyond a transactional space. Thank you. I would also like to thank my committee members, Dr. Abhishek Gangli, Dr. Sage Gerson, who's my first reader, and my second reader, Ijlal. All three of them are here for enabling this thesis. And I now open the floor to questions, comments, responses.